Amidst the grandeur and political intrigue of the Ottoman Empire, there existed a princess whose story is often overshadowed by the towering figures around her. Khazina Sultan, the beloved sister of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was born into an era of immense power, cultural sophistication, and relentless ambition. While history frequently focuses on the exploits of Suleiman or the cunning of Hurrem Sultan, Khazina's life offers a poignant counterpoint, a tale of love, heartbreak, and an enduring struggle for identity within the confines of royal expectations. Born into the gilded walls of the Ottoman court, Khazina's life was one of privilege and complexity. Her world was defined by the delicate balance of power and loyalty. As the sister of the most powerful sultan of the time, she was both a symbol of the empire's grandeur and a pawn in its political strategies. Yet beneath the layers of royal decorum, she was a woman with her own dreams, desires, and vulnerabilities. Her love story with Ibrahim Pasha, a man who rose from slavery to become the Grand Vizier, was both the defining chapter of her life and the seed of her eventual tragedy. Khazina and Ibrahim's bond was a rare tale of mutual affection in a world where marriages were often dictated by political alliances. Their union was celebrated as a triumph of love, a beacon of humanity in a court known for its machinations. Yet, as the tides of power shifted and the burdens of ambition grew heavier, cracks began to appear in their seemingly perfect relationship. The discovery of Ibrahim's second marriage shattered Khazina's world, challenging her notions of trust and loyalty. But Khazina was not one to falter easily. Her resilience in the face of betrayal and her unwavering efforts to preserve their relationship highlighted a strength of character that was both admirable and heartbreaking. As political tensions and personal tragedies mounted, Khazina found herself caught in a web of circumstances beyond her control. The tragic execution of Ibrahim by her own brother, Sultan Suleiman, marked the beginning of a descent into despair, a journey that would ultimately end in her untimely death. Khazina Sultan's life was a microcosm of the Ottoman Empire itself, a blend of glory and sacrifice, power and vulnerability, love and loss. Her story is a reminder that behind the grand narratives of empires lie the deeply personal struggles of those who lived within them. This journey through her life will uncover the trials she faced, the love she cherished, and the pain that consumed her. It is a story that transcends time, speaking to the universal human experience of longing, betrayal, and the search for meaning in a world shaped by forces beyond our control. Khazina Sultan was born into a world of unparalleled power and grandeur. As the sister of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, her childhood was steeped in the wealth and prestige of the Ottoman court. Yet, behind the lavish palaces and embroidered silks, life for an Ottoman princess was far from simple. From a young age, Khazina was groomed in the art of courtly etiquette, diplomacy, and the unspoken rules that governed the lives of royal women. Unlike her brother, whose destiny as ruler was carved in stone, her fate was more uncertain, shaped by the shifting tides of palace politics and the ambitions of those around her. The imperial harem, where she spent much of her early years, was not merely a place of luxury but a world unto itself, governed by its own hierarchies and power struggles. Here, women wielded influence in ways unseen by the outside world. While Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's beloved wife, gradually cemented her dominance within the court, Khazina found herself navigating an existence where her status as the Sultan's sister granted her both privilege and restriction. Unlike Hurrem, whose power grew through her position as the mother of the heir, Khazina's influence was tied to her lineage alone, a factor that both protected and limited her. Despite these constraints, Khazina was not a passive figure. She was educated in literature, history, and the intricacies of statecraft. She understood the weight of her name and the expectations placed upon her. Unlike other women of the court, who were often married off to secure alliances, she wielded some measure of choice when it came to her future. And when she met Ibrahim Pasha, a man of extraordinary intellect and ambition, she made a decision that defied convention, one driven by emotion rather than political necessity. Ibrahim's rise within the Ottoman court was nothing short of extraordinary. A former slave who had become Sultan Suleiman's closest confidant, he was a man who had earned his power rather than inherited it. His keen mind and strategic brilliance made him invaluable to the empire, but it was his bond with Khazina that would set him apart from others who had walked the corridors of Topkapi Palace. Their love was neither a fleeting romance nor a marriage of convenience. It was a partnership built on mutual admiration, one that would become both their greatest strength and their deepest vulnerability. Unlike many royal unions of the time, theirs was not merely a political arrangement. Khazina, despite her royal status, was deeply drawn to Ibrahim's charisma and intellect. In him, she saw not just a powerful man but an equal, someone who understood the burden of ambition, the delicate balance between loyalty and survival. Their marriage was a rare exception in a world where love was often sacrificed at the altar of duty. For a time, they seemed to have defied the rigid expectations of the court, forging a bond that was as personal as it was strategic. But the Ottoman court was not a place where happiness lasted long. The very forces that had propelled Ibrahim to power would eventually conspire against him. As Grand Vizier, he accumulated both wealth and enemies, and his growing independence from Suleiman began to sow the seeds of discord. Meanwhile, Khazina found herself caught in a silent battle within the harem, where shifting alliances and whispered conspiracies could determine one's fate. Though she had been raised to understand the dangers of the court, she had never imagined that they would come so close to destroying the life she had built. Her role as Ibrahim's wife placed her at the heart of Ottoman politics in ways she had never anticipated. She was no longer just the Sultan's sister, she was the wife of a man whose every decision could alter the course of the empire. And in an environment where power was both a weapon and a curse, love alone would not be enough to shield her from what was to come. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where power dictated the course of lives, love was often a luxury few could afford. Yet, against the backdrop of an empire at its peak, Khazina Sultan and Ibrahim Pasha defied the norms of their time, crafting a love story that was as extraordinary as it was dangerous. Their union was not just a marriage, it was a partnership that blurred the lines between love, loyalty, and ambition. For Khazina Sultan, life had been dictated by duty from the moment of her birth. As the sister of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, she was a woman of immense status but limited freedom. Her destiny, like that of many princesses before her, was expected to serve the empire. Yet, unlike most royal women, she had been afforded a rare privilege, the ability to choose her husband. And she chose Ibrahim Pasha, not because of political pressure or strategic advantage, but because she saw in him a man who was her equal in intellect, wit, and ambition. Ibrahim Pasha's rise to power was nothing short of remarkable. A Greek-born slave who had climbed to the heights of the Ottoman court, he had become Sultan Suleiman's most trusted friend and advisor. His story was a testament to the possibilities that lay within the empire, a place where even a foreign-born servant could become one of the most powerful men in the world. But while his loyalty to the Sultan was unquestionable, his heart belonged to Khazina. Unlike the women of the harem, whose fates were tied to the whims of men, she was a woman of independent status, and together, they shared an intimacy that was rare in the gilded cages of Topkapi Palace. Their marriage was met with whispers of both admiration and resentment. Some saw it as a love match that transcended social and political barriers, while others viewed it as an alliance that granted Ibrahim more power than was safe for any one man. The court was a place where envy festered beneath every surface, and their happiness did not go unnoticed. As Grand Vizier, Ibrahim commanded armies, shaped policies, and wielded influence in ways that made him indispensable to the empire. And yet, at the height of his power, he found his greatest solace in Khazina, whose presence offered him the rarest of gifts, love without conditions. But the tides of fate were not kind to love in the Ottoman court. Their marriage, though filled with passion and devotion, was not immune to the pressures of politics. The very things that had brought them together, their defiance of tradition, their shared strength, would also be the forces that tested their bond. Ibrahim was a man of vision, but his growing autonomy from the Sultan made him a target. His enemies, lurking in the shadows of the palace, watched and waited for the moment to strike. The first crack in their perfect world came with whispers of betrayal, not from outside, but from within. Ibrahim, whose responsibilities extended beyond the walls of their home, had taken another wife. Polygamy was common in the Ottoman elite, a practice accepted and expected. But for Khazina, this was not merely tradition, it was a wound to the heart. She had believed their love was different, stronger than the customs that bound others. Learning that he had chosen to share his life with another shattered something within her. Yet, she did not let it break her. She was, after all, an Ottoman princess, a woman raised in a world where personal pain was secondary to duty. Despite the betrayal, she chose to stand by Ibrahim, to protect what they had built. Perhaps she believed that love could overcome even this, or perhaps she understood that in a world ruled by men, survival often meant learning to endure. Whatever the reason, she remained by his side, even as the forces of the court conspired to tear him down. Their love, though wounded, endured until the very end. But fate had already written their final chapter. The court that had once embraced Ibrahim now turned against him. His power, once admired, became a threat. And when Sultan Suleiman, the man who had once called him brother, finally ordered his execution, there was nothing Khazina could do to save him. On the night of his death, the palace fell into silence. The man who had once commanded the Ottoman armies, who had shaped the empire's destiny, was gone. And in his place, Khazina was left with nothing but memories and the weight of a love that had been both her greatest joy and her deepest sorrow. But even in his absence, Ibrahim's presence lingered in her heart. He had been her husband, her confidant, the man she had chosen when she could have chosen anyone else. His death was not just the loss of a statesman, it was the loss of the one person who had understood her beyond her title, beyond the grandeur of her lineage. And as the court moved on, as power shifted hands and history continued its relentless march forward, Khazina was left to navigate a world without him, a world that no longer felt like her own. For years, Khazina Sultan and Ibrahim Pasha had shared a bond that defied the rigid expectations of the Ottoman court. Theirs was a love that had withstood political turbulence, the ever-watchful eyes of envious courtiers, and the weight of responsibility that came with their positions. But love, no matter how strong, was never immune to the realities of power. And in the corridors of Topkapi Palace, where ambition often dictated the course of relationships, even the most devoted hearts could be tested. Khazina had always known that Ottoman men, especially those in positions of power, were expected to take multiple wives. It was a practice deeply woven into the empire's traditions, ensuring alliances and securing political stability. But she had believed, perhaps naively, that her love story was different. Ibrahim was no ordinary man, and she was no ordinary wife. Their marriage had not been arranged for diplomacy or convenience. It had been a rare union of choice, of passion, of mutual respect. She had trusted that, in a world where emotions were often sacrificed for duty, their love would remain untouched by such expectations. The truth arrived not as a dramatic announcement but as a whisper in the shadows. Court gossip had a way of seeping through even the thickest walls, and it was through hushed conversations and stolen glances that Khazina first sensed something was amiss. Servants spoke in coded words, avoiding her gaze when she entered a room. The women of the harem exchanged knowing looks, their silence heavier than words. And then, one evening, the confirmation came, a quiet but undeniable revelation. Ibrahim Pasha had taken another wife. The news struck her like a blade, slow and deep. It was not just the act itself that wounded her, but the secrecy surrounding it. Had he not trusted her enough to tell her himself? Had he assumed she would accept it as any other Ottoman woman might? Or worse, had he known it would break her and chosen to keep it hidden to avoid witnessing her pain? Khazina did not rage, she did not weep before her attendants or demand an explanation in the presence of courtiers. She carried herself with the poise expected of an imperial princess, but inside, something fragile splintered. In the solitude of her chambers, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the betrayal. The man she had defied tradition for, the man she had stood beside against the whispers of the court, had chosen to bind himself to another. And though she knew it was not uncommon for men in his position, that knowledge did little to soothe the ache in her heart. When she finally confronted Ibrahim, she did not raise her voice or let anger guide her words. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered to her: why? Ibrahim, ever the statesman, tried to explain. He spoke of duty, of alliances, of the expectations placed upon him as Grand Vizier. But Khazina did not want to hear about duty. She had lived her entire life under its weight. What she wanted was the truth of his heart. Had she not been enough? Had their love changed? Perhaps sensing this, Ibrahim softened. He assured her that his love for her had not wavered, that she remained the center of his world. But words, no matter how sincere, could not undo what had been done. Trust, once fractured, was not easily restored. And though she remained by his side, something between them had shifted. The laughter they once shared so easily now felt forced. The silences, once comfortable, became heavy with unspoken pain. Khazina had a choice. She could have turned away from him, let resentment consume her, and allowed this betrayal to define their story. But she was an Ottoman princess, raised to endure. She had seen too many women in the palace fade into obscurity after heartbreak. She refused to be one of them. If she could not erase the pain, she would at least master it. She chose to stay, to forgive, not because she had forgotten, but because she understood the reality of their world. Love alone was never enough to protect one from the currents of politics and ambition. And though Ibrahim had wounded her, she still saw in him the man she had once chosen above all others. She would not let this be the end of them. But the world beyond their marriage was shifting. The court had been watching, waiting for cracks to appear in Ibrahim's seemingly untouchable position. And now, those who envied his power had found an opening. If he could deceive the woman who had loved him most, could he also deceive the Sultan? Could he truly be trusted? Unbeknownst to them both, the revelation of his second marriage was more than just a personal betrayal. It was the first note in a requiem that would soon reach its tragic crescendo. And though Khazina had chosen to stand by him, fate had already begun to weave the threads of their undoing. Khazina Sultan had spent her entire life in a world where emotions were carefully concealed behind layers of protocol and duty. But for the first time, she found herself at a crossroads where neither her royal upbringing nor her deep love for Ibrahim Pasha could guide her. The discovery of his second marriage had shaken her to the core, yet she was not a woman who surrendered easily. If there was still a chance to save what they had built together, she was willing to fight for it. Ibrahim, too, sensed the growing chasm between them. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the Ottoman court, but nothing had prepared him for the silent war now waging in his own home. Khazina had not erupted in fury nor demanded public vengeance, but her quiet withdrawal spoke louder than any words. The warmth in her eyes had dimmed, the effortless laughter they once shared had faded, and the space between them felt colder with each passing day. Realizing the gravity of his mistake, Ibrahim sought to mend what had been broken. He made efforts to reassure her, speaking of his unwavering love and devotion. Gifts arrived at her chambers, exquisite silks from the farthest reaches of the empire, rare jewels meant to symbolize the value she held in his life. He arranged for private dinners, where he tried to bridge the distance with soft-spoken words and shared memories of their early days. But material gestures could not erase the lingering sting of betrayal. Khazina did not reject his attempts, but neither did she fully embrace them. She was not a woman who could be bought with diamonds or calmed with hollow reassurances. What she needed was not just words but proof that she still held the same place in his heart, that she had not been reduced to just one among his many political obligations. She needed to know that what they had was still real. She, too, made efforts. There were moments when she allowed herself to believe that love could triumph over pain. She tried to see beyond the hurt, reminding herself of the man who had once defied all expectations for her, who had loved her not as a princess but as a woman. She softened in her interactions with him, finding fleeting glimpses of the tenderness they had once shared. But trust, once fractured, is not easily restored. Ibrahim had other responsibilities, affairs of state that demanded his time, pressures from the court that required his focus. And though he wished to repair his marriage, the world around them did not pause for their reconciliation. The palace whispers did not cease. If anything, they grew louder. The harem women who once envied Khazina's unique love story now found satisfaction in her silent suffering. The viziers who feared Ibrahim's power watched with interest, sensing weakness in a man who had once seemed untouchable. Even Sultan Suleiman, who had always regarded Ibrahim as a brother, could not ignore the shifting dynamics. If Ibrahim could falter in his personal life, could he falter in his loyalty to the throne as well? Khazina fought against the tide, but doubt had taken root. She had spent years believing in a love that transcended the rigid expectations of the empire, but now, she wondered, had she been naive? Had she placed her trust in a man who, despite his love for her, was ultimately bound by the same forces that governed all men in power? Despite their efforts, an unspoken truth loomed between them. Love, no matter how fierce, could not erase the past. It could mend wounds, but it could not erase scars. They could move forward, but they could never return to what they once were. And yet, they did not let go. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was a shared refusal to surrender to fate. They continued their dance, two souls caught between love and obligation, trying to salvage a story that had once felt unbreakable. But outside the walls of their home, forces were already conspiring. Their love story was no longer just their own. It had become entangled in the web of palace politics, ambition, and betrayal. And no matter how desperately they tried to hold on, destiny had already chosen a different path for them. The halls of Topkapi Palace had seen countless intrigues, but few as heartbreaking as the fall of Ibrahim Pasha. He had once stood at the pinnacle of power, the most trusted man in the empire, a brother in all but blood to Sultan Suleiman. Yet, in the dead of night, as the city of Constantinople lay in slumber, his fate was sealed with chilling finality. Khazina Sultan had sensed the shifting winds long before the final blow was struck. The love she had fought to preserve had already been strained by betrayal, but now, it was overshadowed by something far greater, a political storm that threatened to consume the man she had once believed invincible. In the corridors of the palace, whispers turned to warnings, and warnings became dread. Even those who once envied Ibrahim now spoke of his impending doom with a quiet reverence, as if his fate had already been carved into stone. It was not a single moment that led to his downfall, but the slow accumulation of missteps, enemies, and misjudged alliances. Ibrahim had grown too powerful, too independent in his decisions, and too bold in his confidence. Where once his proximity to the Sultan had been his greatest strength, it had now become his greatest weakness. The very man who had raised him to greatness was now the one to strip it all away. The final betrayal came not from the court but from the chambers of the Sultan himself. Suleiman, tormented by the doubts planted by his advisors, particularly those who viewed Ibrahim as a threat, was no longer the same friend who had once entrusted him with the empire. The accusations were subtle at first. That Ibrahim had grown too arrogant, that he ruled as an equal rather than a servant, that his foreign ties made him unreliable. But they planted seeds of suspicion in the Sultan's mind, and suspicion was all that was needed. On a fateful night, Ibrahim was invited to dine with Suleiman, an invitation he could not refuse. The two men, once bound by an unbreakable brotherhood, sat across from each other in an eerie silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. Was there a moment when Ibrahim realized this would be his last meal? Did he see the flicker of hesitation in the Sultan's eyes, the sorrow that could not be voiced? Or did he cling to the belief that their bond was still intact, that no matter how much the world had turned against him, Suleiman would never betray him? But power spares no one. That night, after he retired to his chambers, the silence was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. The guards came in the name of the Sultan, but they did not come for protection. They came with a decree of death. There was no grand trial, no final plea for mercy. The man who had once commanded armies, who had shaped the empire's fate, was now strangled in the darkness of his own room, his life stolen away as if it had never mattered. Khazina Sultan awoke to a world that had changed irreversibly. There were no public proclamations, no grand funerals for the man who had once held the empire in his grasp. His body was taken away in secrecy, buried without honor, his name wiped from the court as if he had never existed. Those who had once bowed before him now turned their backs, whispering of his fall as a lesson for those who dared to rise too high. But for Khazina, this was not just the loss of a statesman or a political force. It was the loss of the man she had loved, despite everything. The pain of his betrayal had been great, but the pain of his death was unbearable. She had spent years trying to hold their love together, trying to find a way forward despite the wounds they had inflicted on each other. And now, there was nothing left to mend. The story had ended, not with reconciliation, but with tragedy. She wandered the palace halls in a daze, unable to comprehend the depth of what had happened. The man she had once shared dreams with was now a ghost, his absence a silent scream that echoed in every corner. Did he know, in his final moments, that she had never truly stopped loving him? That despite the hurt, despite the betrayals, she would have chosen him over power, over position, over the world itself. But regret changes nothing. The empire moved forward, as it always did. Ibrahim Pasha became another name in the annals of history, his rise and fall reduced to a cautionary tale. But for Khazina Sultan, he was never just a name. He was the love she had fought for, the heartbreak she had endured, and the loss that would haunt her forever. And as she stood in the lonely silence of the palace, she realized that she, too, was lost. Not to the world, but to herself. The halls of Topkapi Palace no longer felt like home. Where once there had been music and whispers of love, there was now only silence. Khazina Sultan had spent years in the heart of the Ottoman court, surrounded by power, intrigue, and the intoxicating presence of the man she had loved beyond reason. But with Ibrahim Pasha's death, she had been cast into a void from which there was no escape. In the days following his execution, she withdrew from the world, shrouded in a grief that no one could understand. The palace corridors, once filled with his laughter, now felt like a mausoleum. Every sight, every sound, every memory was a dagger to the heart. She knew that Ibrahim had been flawed, arrogant, ambitious, and reckless in his rise to power, but he had also been hers. And now, he was gone, buried in disgrace, his name erased from the records of the court. The Sultan, her brother, had become a stranger. Though she was still a princess of the empire, she felt like a prisoner. The betrayal cut too deep. How could the man she had grown up with, the brother who had once protected her, have condemned the love of her life? She saw it in Suleiman's eyes when they met, a sadness he did not speak of, a wound he knew would never heal. Yet, the damage had been done. He had chosen the empire over brotherhood, over friendship, over love. And in doing so, he had destroyed the only man who had ever truly mattered to her. But in the Ottoman court, grief was not an indulgence that could last forever. Life moved on. The empire continued to expand, wars were fought, alliances were made and broken. Yet, for Khazina, time had frozen on the night Ibrahim was taken from her. She no longer cared for the affairs of the court, no longer engaged in the intrigues that once fascinated her. She withdrew to her private quarters, refusing visitors, refusing to participate in the empire's endless cycle of power and ambition. There were days when she wandered the gardens where she and Ibrahim had once walked, where they had spoken of a future they now would never share. She thought of his hands in hers, the way he had looked at her when they were alone, stripped of the burdens of power. She remembered the fire in his eyes, the passion in his voice, the promises he had made. And then, she remembered the coldness of his betrayal, the moment she had learned of his second marriage, the pain of realizing she had not been enough. It was a torment she could not escape, caught between love and resentment, between longing and anger. Some in the palace whispered that she had lost her mind, that she spoke to his ghost in the dead of night, that she still wrote him letters she would never send. Others claimed she had taken to acts of secret defiance, refusing to acknowledge those who had plotted against him, refusing to show submission to the court that had sentenced him to death. But the truth was simpler. She was a woman who had lost everything, and there was no place left for her in the world she had once known. With each passing year, her isolation deepened. She stopped attending royal gatherings, stopped entertaining guests. The luxuries of the palace felt meaningless, the wealth and titles she possessed a cruel mockery of the life she had once dreamed of. Servants would find her staring out at the Bosphorus for hours, lost in thoughts of what could have been. She ate little, spoke less. The once vibrant princess, whose presence had once commanded attention, had become a shadow of herself. Time was unkind. The empire changed, and so did those around her. Mirima, her niece, grew into a powerful force in the court, while Hurrem Sultan, the ever-dominant presence, continued to wield her influence. But Khazina no longer cared for the shifting tides of power. She had once fought for love, for happiness, but now, there was nothing left to fight for. And then came the realization she had been dreading for years: Ibrahim was truly gone. No amount of grief could bring him back. No tears, no whispered prayers in the darkness, no lingering memories could undo what had been done. And if he was gone, then who was she? What was she without him? Her isolation was no longer just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, all-consuming. She was a princess, yet she felt like a prisoner. Not of the empire, not of the court, but of her own sorrow. There was no escape from it, no solace. Only the unbearable weight of what had been lost. The world had moved on. But Khazina Sultan never did. The days blurred into nights, and time became meaningless in the life of Khazina Sultan. Grief had become her constant companion, weaving itself into the very fabric of her existence. The palace, once a place of grandeur and joy, had turned into a prison of memories. Every corner whispered Ibrahim's name, every shadow held echoes of his laughter. But the worst torment was the silence, the unbearable quiet that had settled into her chambers, where once there had been love, passion, and life. She had endured years of sorrow, but sorrow alone did not kill a person. It was hope, the faintest flicker of it, that destroyed her. The hope that, perhaps, one day the pain would ease, that she would wake up and not feel the crushing weight of loss. But as the years passed, it became clear that such a day would never come. No matter how much time separated her from Ibrahim's tragic execution, the wound remained as fresh as the night he was taken from her. The court moved on without her. Her brother, Sultan Suleiman, had grown older, burdened by the weight of his own regrets. Hurrem Sultan, once the most powerful woman in the empire, was now battling her own declining health. Mirima, her niece, had carved her own place in the political landscape, a force to be reckoned with. But Khazina Sultan remained frozen in time, unable to escape the past. She had become a relic of a love story that had ended in blood and betrayal. She tried to find meaning in solitude, but isolation only deepened the ache in her heart. The walls of the palace, once adorned with beauty and luxury, now felt suffocating. She could not leave, and yet, she could not bear to stay. The empire that she had once loved, that had given her everything, had taken the one thing she truly needed. Without Ibrahim, she was a ghost of herself, a woman wandering through a life that no longer belonged to her. There were moments when she imagined what life could have been if things had been different, if Ibrahim had been more careful, if court politics had not conspired against him, if her own brother had found it in his heart to spare him. But every time she allowed herself to dream, reality would come crashing back, merciless and cruel. There was no undoing the past. There was no way to rewrite her fate. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of a dying sun, she sat by her window overlooking the Bosphorus. The water shimmered with the reflection of the fading light, a mirror to the thoughts that weighed heavily on her soul. In her hands, she held the letters she had written to Ibrahim over the years, words of longing, of regret, of love that had nowhere to go. She read them one last time, tracing the ink with trembling fingers, as if by doing so, she could reach across time and hold him once more. She had spent years mourning him, waiting for the day when the pain would lessen, when she would wake up and feel whole again. But that day had never come. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it never would. The life she had dreamed of had ended with Ibrahim. She had merely been existing in its shadow. That night, the palace fell into its usual quiet. The servants, long accustomed to her solitude, assumed she had gone to bed early. No one suspected that it would be the last night of Khazina Sultan's life. No one knew that she had made her decision, that she had finally found a way to reunite with the only man she had ever loved. When morning came, the sun rose as it always did, casting golden light upon the empire. But behind the doors of Khazina Sultan's chambers, there was only darkness. The princess, once a woman of strength, passion, and resilience, was found lifeless in her room. Whether she had taken poison or simply allowed her heart to stop beating, no one could say for certain. What was undeniable, however, was that she had chosen to leave on her own terms. The news sent a ripple through the court. Whispers filled the palace, some speaking of tragedy, others of a love story that had finally come to its rightful end. Sultan Suleiman, upon hearing the news, remained silent for a long time. Those who saw him that day swore they had never seen such sorrow in his eyes. He had lost not only a sister but the last living remnant of Ibrahim Pasha. Her burial was quiet, lacking the grand processions that usually accompanied a royal death. But in the hearts of those who had known her, she was remembered not just as a princess, but as a woman who had loved with such intensity that she could not bear to live without it. Perhaps, in death, she had finally found the peace that had eluded her in life. Perhaps, in some place beyond the reach of the empire, beyond power, beyond betrayal, she had been reunited with the man she had loved more than life itself. The story of Khazina Sultan is one woven with love, power, sacrifice, and heartbreak. A woman born into one of the greatest empires in history, she had everything: wealth, status, influence. Yet, despite all the luxuries and privileges bestowed upon her, she was ultimately left with nothing but sorrow. In the grandeur of the Ottoman court, where ambition often overshadowed emotion, she was one of the few who chose love over politics. But fate had its own plans, and love, in its most tragic form, became her greatest torment. Her union with Ibrahim Pasha was not just a marriage, it was a partnership built on deep affection and understanding. Unlike many royal unions that were forged out of duty or political necessity, theirs was one of choice. She, a princess of the Ottoman Empire, and he, a man of ambition and brilliance, defied the conventions of their time. Together, they were a force, two souls bound by devotion, despite the storms that surrounded them. But in a world where power dictated fate, love alone was not enough. The betrayal she felt upon discovering Ibrahim's second marriage was not just a wound to her heart, it was a deep fracture in the foundation of their bond. And yet, despite her pain, she chose to forgive. In a time when women of the court were expected to either submit or retaliate, she made a different choice. She endured. She fought to keep the love they had built, knowing that despite his mistakes, Ibrahim still loved her. And so, she stayed, even when it hurt. Even when it would have been easier to walk away. But endurance came at a cost. When Ibrahim fell from grace, she was left to bear the unimaginable. His execution was not just the loss of a husband, it was the destruction of everything she had fought for. In a single night, the world she had known shattered, leaving her adrift in grief. Though she continued to live, her heart had already died with him. The palace walls became her prison, and the whispers of the court only deepened her loneliness. Sultan Suleiman, her brother, may have believed he was acting in the best interest of the empire when he ordered Ibrahim's death, but he could not have foreseen the consequences of his actions on his own sister. Perhaps he thought time would heal her wounds, that she would move forward as the empire always did. But Suleiman, despite all his wisdom and power, underestimated the depth of her love and the weight of her sorrow. Her final act, her decision to end her own life, was one of ultimate surrender. She had fought for so long, but in the end, there was nothing left to fight for. She had given everything she had to love, only to be left with emptiness. In choosing to leave this world, she reunited with Ibrahim in the only way she could. To some, it may have been a tragedy, to others, a poetic conclusion to a love story that had defied the odds but succumbed to fate. Yet, despite the sorrow that defined her final years, Khazina Sultan's legacy did not fade. Her story remained etched in the history of the Ottoman court, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the power of love. In an empire where rulers were remembered for conquests and political strategies, she was remembered for something far more profound: her ability to love without restraint, to endure heartbreak with dignity, and to remain unwavering in her devotion even when the world gave her every reason to give up. Her name may not have been written in the annals of war or diplomacy, but it was whispered in the halls of the palace long after she was gone. Servants, nobles, and even sultans who came after her knew of the princess who had loved too deeply, who had suffered too greatly, and who had ultimately chosen her own fate. Her brother, Sultan Suleiman, carried the weight of her loss. As time passed, and he too faced the inevitable decline of his reign, it is said that he often reflected on the choices he had made. The loss of Ibrahim Pasha had been necessary for the empire, but at what cost? The death of his beloved sister, the sorrow that haunted his later years, these were wounds that power could not heal. In the grand scheme of history, Khazina Sultan may not have shaped empires or led armies, but her story is one that lingers. It reminds us that even in the most powerful courts, even among those who seemingly have everything, love remains the most unpredictable and uncontrollable force. It can elevate a person to great heights, and it can just as easily bring them to ruin. Her story is not just one of tragedy, it is one of resilience, of devotion, and of the unbreakable bond between two souls who found each other in a world governed by ambition and betrayal. And perhaps, beyond the confines of this world, in a realm untouched by power and politics, she finally found the peace she had been searching for.